What if we could witness a debate between John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln? Using advanced AI technologies, I've simulated this monumental confrontation and divided it into 4 central themes. Should America prioritize growth or equality? To what extent should individual freedom be sacrificed to ensure collective well-being? Should the United States focus on domestic interests or take on a leadership role on the global stage? And finally, should we preserve traditional values or continuously adapt to cultural changes? Before we begin, it's important to note that this is a fictional and creative debate. The opinions presented here are based on data and do not necessarily reflect the exact words or intentions of the debaters. The aim is to foster reflection and discussion in an educational and respectful manner. This content is purely for informational and entertainment purposes. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming debates. Now let's dive into the results of this experiment. Gentlemen, the economy is the engine of any nation. However, a fundamental tension shapes its direction. Should we prioritize economic growth or strive for equality among citizens? I invite each of you to present your stance.
To me, equality must be America's central priority. A nation where a few thrive while many struggle to survive is a nation sowing the seeds of its own instability. Economic growth is not sustainable if the benefits of that growth are not shared equitably. I believe in policies that uplift the disadvantaged, accessible education, social programs, and investments in infrastructure that benefit everyone. These are the pillars of an economy that not only grows but grows for all.
With all due respect, Mr. Kennedy, I see this issue differently. Economic growth is the foundation upon which equality must be built. Without prosperity, there is no wealth to redistribute, no resources to fund social programs. My experience during the Civil War taught me that, in times of crisis, the priority must be to strengthen the nation's economic base. The freedom to pursue opportunity is what makes America exceptional. A free market with minimal government interference empowers the individual and, in turn, benefits society as a whole.
That's an admirable vision, Mr. Lincoln, but I wonder, what about the millions of Americans who, even in a free market, can never escape poverty? Economic freedom is illusory for those facing systemic inequality. During my presidency, I saw how programs like the New Frontier began to correct these disparities, offering real opportunities to those who never had them. The government is not the enemy, but a tool to ensure no one is left behind.
You speak with passion, Mr. Kennedy, but my concern lies with the long-term effects. When the government intervenes too much, it risks stifling individual initiative and creating dangerous dependency. During my administration, the greatest gift I could offer Americans was the freedom to shape their own destinies. It wasn't about handing out subsidies, but creating an environment where hard work and merit were rewarded. Excessive intervention can weaken the character and self-determination of the people.
So, are you suggesting that poverty is a matter of character? Because to me it's not. It's a matter of unequal opportunities. Without accessible education and fair wages, how can we expect the average worker to thrive? The New Deal, which preceded me, didn't weaken American character. It strengthened the middle class and revitalized the economy. That proves that with the right policies, we can balance growth and equality.
Interesting, but let me use an analogy. Building an economy is like constructing a house. If you spend all your time decorating the rooms before establishing a solid foundation, the house will collapse. Growth is the foundation. Equality might be the decor. Without a strong economy, even the most well-intentioned social programs will run out of funding.
And I'd say, Mr. Lincoln, that a house is not worth living in if half its residents are freezing in unheated rooms, while the other half sleeps in luxury. Growth without equality is like building a mansion while the entire neighborhood sinks into despair. A fair economy is not a choice. It's a necessity for social and political stability.
I agree that poverty is a problem we must fight. During my presidency, I fought for the freedom of all men because I believed that without freedom, equality was impossible. But that same belief leads me to question policies that centralize too much power in the government. Who decides what is fair? Who ensures the government always acts in the people's best interest? I prefer to trust individuals to find their own way in a fair market.
And I ask, who ensures the market is truly fair? Economic crises show that without regulation, the market favors the rich and powerful, leaving workers adrift. The Great Depression was the ultimate example of this. Policies like the New Deal not only saved the economy, but also saved democracy by restoring people's trust in the system.
You raise valid points, but even during the Civil War, when I faced the monumental task of preserving the Union, I never lost sight of the importance of individual responsibility. Every citizen must have the opportunity to contribute to the economy, but over-reliance on the government can weaken that contribution.
I respect your dedication to principles, Mr. Lincoln, but we live in different times. Today, corporations are as powerful as governments, and the common worker needs protection. It's not about creating dependence, but leveling the playing field so everyone has a fair shot at the American dream.
Imagine a tree, Mr. Kennedy. Growth is the trunk, providing support to the structure. Equality is the branches, spreading and reaching every corner. Without the trunk, the branches cannot survive. What I propose is an economy where the trunk is strong enough to sustain the branches, but without compromising its integrity by carrying unnecessary weight.
And I say that a tree without branches is barren, incapable of providing shade or bearing fruit. Growth without equality is an empty promise. Our economy must be more than numbers on a spreadsheet. It must reflect the values of justice and opportunity that define us as a nation.
Gentlemen, individual freedom is one of the pillars of democracy, but there are moments when it conflicts with collective well-being. The question I pose to you is, to what extent should individual freedom be sacrificed to ensure the greater good?
I believe individual freedom is fundamental, but it does not exist in a vacuum. We live in an interconnected society. History shows us that in times of crisis, sacrificing a small portion of individual freedom for the collective good not only protects the majority, but also preserves liberty itself in the long run. During my presidency, we championed civil rights and social programs because we understood that one's freedom ends where another's oppression begins. This isn't about limiting freedom, it's about finding an ethical balance.
Mr. Kennedy, I value your vision of balance, but I believe any sacrifice of individual freedom must be approached with the utmost caution. During the Civil War, I made decisions that some saw as limitations on freedom, such as suspending habeas corpus, but those actions were temporary measures to save the nation. Sacrificing freedom for the collective good must be the exception, not the rule. A society that trades freedom for security risks losing both.
I agree that it must be the exception, but in modern times, the collective good includes challenges like public health, climate change, and systemic inequality. For instance, the freedom not to vaccinate can endanger the health of millions. What is freedom if it threatens the lives of others? Temporary and proportional sacrifices do not erode liberty. They protect the fabric of society.
Your concern for public health is valid, but I must ask, where do we draw the line? If we justify small limitations today, what stops future governments from expanding these restrictions? During my presidency, I faced severe criticism for actions like the Emancipation Proclamation, which many saw as a violation of individual freedoms. Yet, every decision I made was guided by the principle of preserving the Union and ensuring liberty. Freedom is not something to be negotiated lightly.
But, Mr. Lincoln, the individual freedoms you defend also need clear boundaries to protect the most vulnerable. During the Civil Rights Movement, we saw how freedom was used as an excuse to maintain discriminatory practices. We cannot allow freedom to become a pretext for oppression or disregard for the collective good.
I agree that freedom should never be an excuse for injustice, but restrictions imposed by the government must always be specific and temporary, never permanent. My concern is that sacrificing freedom, even with the best intentions, can set dangerous precedents. I would rather trust the good sense of the people, educating them to make decisions that benefit both themselves and society.
With all due respect, Mr. Lincoln, relying solely on the good sense of people might be too idealistic. The recent pandemic showed that without clear guidelines and regulations, many prioritized personal convenience over the collective good. The government, as the steward of society, has a responsibility to intervene when individual choices put lives at risk.
Mr. Kennedy, you speak with passion, but there is a difference between intervention and imposition. During the Civil War, I led a divided country where each state defended its own freedom. Yet, I fought to unify the nation without compromising the fundamental principles of individual liberty. My belief is that by strengthening freedom, we also strengthen collective well-being.
Let's use an analogy. Imagine society as a boat on the open sea. If everyone does as they please, rowing in different directions or drilling holes in the hull to exercise their freedom, the boat sinks. Individual freedom cannot mean the right to sabotage everyone's survival. We need rules. We need a common purpose.
An interesting analogy, but let me expand it. Imagine that, on this same boat, the captain decides that some freedoms must be restricted to prevent mutiny. Over time, he continues to impose more and more restrictions until the boat is no longer a place of freedom, but a floating prison. Rules are necessary, but they must be limited and respect the fundamental rights of every individual. After all, a boat propelled by force rather than willpower won't get very far.
I believe individual freedom is a sacred right, but it cannot be used to justify neglecting the well-being of others. Freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. Temporary sacrifices for the common good do not threaten our liberty, they protect it.
I agree that freedom and responsibility are inseparable, but true responsibility lies in recognizing that without individual freedom, no collective good can endure. The challenge is to protect both without compromising one for the other.
Today's question strikes at the heart of America's identity and role in the world. Should we prioritize our domestic interests or embrace a role of global leadership? Our debaters, John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln, will present their arguments. Let's begin.
I believe the United States has a moral and strategic responsibility to lead on the global stage. We are a nation built on the ideals of freedom, democracy, and progress. If we don't lead, others with very different values will fill the void. The Cold War showed us what happens when we fail to take the lead. Authoritarian regimes thrive, conflicts escalate, and our own security is threatened. Leading globally is not a distraction. It's an extension of what it means to be American.
Mr. Kennedy, while I admire your idealism, my priority will always lie with domestic interests. During the Civil War, my focus was on saving the Union, because without a strong foundation at home, no influence abroad matters. Our first duty is to our own citizens. If the government neglects domestic needs in pursuit of a global role, it betrays the trust placed in it. America's strength comes from within, not from without.
Mr. Lincoln, I agree that we must care for our home, but we live in an interconnected world. An isolated America is a vulnerable America. During my presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted how global issues can quickly reach our doorstep. Leading on the world stage is, in fact, a way to protect our domestic interests. Diplomacy, alliances, and even foreign aid are investments in our own security.
There are certainly moments when external engagement is necessary, but it should not become our priority. During my administration, I faced pressures to take stances on global issues, but I knew our survival as a nation depended on resolving our internal conflicts. A divided country with discontented citizens cannot lead the world. True leadership begins with a strong foundation at home.
But, Mr. Lincoln, a strong foundation does not mean isolation. The Marshall Plan after World War II demonstrated how global leadership strengthens our economy and positively influences the world. Abandoning the global stage allows other nations, like the Soviet Union in my time, to shape the world in their image. Can we really afford to take that risk?
The Marshall Plan wouldn't have been possible without a strong and united country to fund it. My point isn't about total isolation, but about priorities. A government that neglects its domestic obligations in favor of global leadership is fooling itself. History teaches us that great empires fell when they overextended themselves, forgetting to care for their foundations.
Let's use an analogy. Imagine the United States as a great tree. The roots are our domestic interests, and the branches are our global presence. If we ignore the branches, they decay and stop bearing fruit. Strengthening our roots is important, but we must care for the entire tree so it grows healthy and influences the ecosystem around it.
I would say that a tree with excessively long and heavy branches can topple if its roots aren't strong enough. America's strength must be focused on resolving our internal divisions, ensuring prosperity for our citizens, and protecting our institutions. Without that, any global effort will be unsustainable and ultimately harmful.
But consider this. If we abdicate our role on the global stage, who will fill the void? In my time, I saw how totalitarian regimes thrived where democracy failed to act. It's not just about protecting what we have, it's about expanding the values we stand for. Our global engagement isn't a burden, it's a mission that gives purpose to our power.
Your idealism is inspiring, Mr. Kennedy, but it's also dangerous if it leads us to neglect our own problems. During the Civil War, I faced the reality of a nation on the brink of collapse. Imagine if, during that time, I had focused on leading internationally while the states remained divided. We wouldn't have a union to defend. The world respects leaders who solve their own problems before attempting to solve others.
And I would say the world respects leaders who have the courage to act, not just for their own benefit, but for humanity. When we confronted racism, social injustices, and the Cold War, our example inspired the world. Global leadership is the natural extension of our values and our power.
But what kind of example will we set if we neglect our own people? True leadership isn't imposed, it's earned, and it begins at home. When we build a nation so strong, so just, and so united that others want to follow us, that's when we truly lead, without the need for excessive interventions.
Global leadership is not a deviation from our domestic interests. It's an extension of them. Protecting America means protecting our values in a world where they are constantly under threat. History calls on us to lead, and refusing that call would be abandoning our responsibility.
The United States has an important role in the world, but that role can only be fulfilled when our house is in order. We must prioritize our internal divisions, inequalities, and prosperity. True global leadership is born from a foundation that is solid and unshakable.
Gentlemen, culture is the heart of a nation. Today, we address a fundamental question for the United States. Should we preserve the traditional values that have shaped our society, or should we continuously adapt to cultural changes? Let's hear from our debaters.
Thank you. I think traditional values have their place, but a nation thrives only when it adapts to cultural changes. America's history is one of progress. From the abolitionist movement to the advancement of civil rights, every step forward has challenged us to reevaluate and redefine our values. This isn't about abandoning traditions, but reinterpreting them to reflect the times we live in. Without adaptation, culture becomes an obstacle to progress rather than a force driving it.
Mr. Kennedy, I admire your focus on progress, but I believe traditional values are the foundation of our identity as a nation. They are not merely customs, they are principles that have guided us through our most difficult times. During the Civil War, the preservation of these values, liberty, equality under the law, and national unity, saved the Union. Adaptation may be necessary, but not at the cost of abandoning what defines us as a people.
I agree that values are important, Mr. Lincoln, but I ask, how can we speak of liberty and equality if we are unwilling to reevaluate what those words mean? In my time, we saw how the civil rights movement challenged traditional ideas about race and equality. Adapting to cultural change isn't a threat. It's a commitment to the very ideals you champion.
I acknowledge that social progress is necessary, but the danger lies in changing too quickly or without deep reflection. During my presidency, I faced pressure to act swiftly, but I knew rash decisions could destabilize the nation. Traditional values provide stability in times of change. They are the anchor that prevents society from being carried away by every new idea.
But stability without change can lead to stagnation. Traditional values only hold meaning if they are lived in a way that's relevant. During the civil rights movement, many used tradition to justify segregation. Was that stability or resistance to progress? We need a culture that evolves, not one tethered to the past like an anchor that prevents the ship from moving forward.
Mr. Kennedy, it's true that some traditions have been misused, but we must not confuse the misuse of values with the values themselves. Tradition is not the enemy of progress. It is the fertile soil in which progress can grow. Emancipation, which you mentioned, was not a break with traditional values, but a reaffirmation of the fundamental value of liberty.
But the liberty you defended had to be redefined in your time, Mr. Lincoln. What was liberty for some was oppression for others, and the same remains true today. Traditional values must evolve to ensure they are inclusive and just. Without that, we merely perpetuate injustices under the guise of tradition.
I agree that liberty must be inclusive, but rapid or poorly considered changes can create new divisions rather than solve old ones. During Reconstruction, we faced the challenge of integrating the South while preserving the fundamental principles of the Union. That integration required patience and balance, not a wholesale rejection of traditional values.
Think of America as a bridge. Traditional values are the pillars supporting the structure, but if we don't reinforce and adapt this bridge to modern conditions, stronger winds, heavier traffic, it will collapse. Adapting doesn't destroy the bridge. It ensures it remains strong and functional for future generations.
An interesting analogy, Mr. Kennedy, but I would argue that if we start changing the pillars without fully understanding their purpose, we risk compromising the bridge's stability. Every change must be made with care and respect for the foundation. If we disregard the importance of traditional values, we risk building something that won't last.
And I would say that a bridge that isn't adapted to modern needs is no longer useful, Mr. Lincoln. Traditional values are important, but not more so than the commitment to ensuring those values serve all Americans, not just a few.
And I would argue that progress that ignores foundational traditions is like building a castle on sand. It may seem grand for a time, but it will eventually collapse. True progress respects and builds upon timeless values.
Traditional values should inspire us to evolve, not trap us in the past. Culture is dynamic, and we must embrace changes that bring justice and relevance to our ideals. Adapting is not weakness, it is wisdom.
Change is inevitable, but we must always ask, are we preserving what is essential? Traditional values are not barriers to progress. They are the beacon that guides our journey. Without them, we risk losing our way.
And so we conclude this fascinating clash between tradition and cultural change. Now, we want to hear from you. Which side do you think presented the most compelling arguments? Lincoln's view, emphasizing traditional values as the foundation for stability and sustainable progress, or Kennedy's perspective, championing continuous adaptation as the path to a just and inclusive society? The question remains, what should truly guide America? Its historical roots or its capacity to reinvent itself? It's up to each of us to decide. Share your thoughts in the comments and join the debate. If you enjoyed this content, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming debates. And we want to hear from you. What other topics or great minds would you like to see debating here? Your suggestion could inspire our next episode. Stay tuned for more thought-provoking and inspiring dialogues.